been one of the most disturbing aspects of this election season about Trump's rise in politics is how we seem to have set aside the values that people like Dan stood for and Bob stood for and that I was taught, and those didn't used to be Republican Democratic values.
There are speeches in American history that never mention the man they are about. No name spoken, no finger pointed, no accusation made directly, and yet everyone listening knows exactly who is being described. That is the most dangerous kind of speech in American politics, because you cannot fight a name that was never said. You cannot escape a description that fits too well. On March 6, 2026, inside the House of Hope mega church in Chicago, with thousands in attendance and cameras broadcasting nationwide, Barack Obama delivered exactly that kind of speech at the funeral of Jesse Jackson. Hit that like button and subscribe right now, because this moment did not just happen at a funeral. It happened at the intersection of 15 years of history, unfinished arguments, and a rivalry that never needed to be declared to be completely real. To understand why it landed the way it did, you have to go back to where it started. In 2011, Donald Trump stood in front of cameras and declared that only a weak, ineffective president would start a war with Iran just to look strong. He said it with the confidence of a man who believed he was describing someone else's failure in advance. He repeated it for years, turning it into a kind of signature accusation, a test of character, a definition of bad leadership. On February 28, 2026, Donald Trump started a war with Iran. That single reversal did not need commentary. It did not need analysis. The timeline handled everything on its own. But there was more underneath it, a longer thread that tied the two men together in ways neither could fully untangle from. In 2015, Obama had negotiated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, a deal that reduced Iran's nuclear capacity dramatically in exchange for sanctions relief. It was supported by international partners, verified by inspectors, and backed by a coalition of nations who agreed that diplomacy, however imperfect, was better than the alternative. Trump withdrew from it in 2018. He called it the worst deal ever made. He said it with the certainty of a man dismantling a house he had never built and replacing it with something he had not yet designed. Years later, after conflict, casualties, and significant economic fallout, analysts began asking the question that had been gathering quietly in the background. Would Trump end up with a deal worse than Obama's? Reports suggested yes, that after the war and the instability, Iran retained leverage and concessions it had not previously held. The contrast became unavoidable and uncomfortable. Either the war achieved something diplomacy genuinely could not, or it replaced a working agreement with something weaker at a far higher cost in blood, money, and international trust. The public tension between the two men had been building long before the funeral. In 2025, Trump accused Obama of treason. No evidence was offered. No specific crime was named. Obama's office responded in unusually direct terms, calling the claims bizarre and describing them as a weak attempt at distraction. The language was measured, but the message was clear. Something had shifted. The restraint that had defined Obama's post-presidential posture for years was beginning to wear thin. Later that year, Obama sharpened his public criticism of Trump's leadership, describing a political environment he believed was saturated with chaos, misinformation, and deliberate division. He did not yell. He did not perform. He stated it plainly, the way someone speaks when they have decided that staying vague is no longer an option. Then came the funeral. The room inside that mega church was not a political arena. It was a place of mourning for one of the most consequential civil rights figures of the 20th century. Jesse Jackson had spent decades building bridges between communities, standing in uncomfortable places, and refusing to leave until something changed. His life was a monument to the idea that systems can be challenged, that voices can be amplified, and that hope, however inconvenient, is not optional. Obama spoke about that legacy. He spoke about opportunity, about a younger version of himself who once felt he might not belong anywhere until he looked up and saw leaders making room. It was personal. It was grounded. It was the kind of speech that earns its gravity before it asks anything of the audience. And then, near the end, he turned toward the present. Still without naming anyone, he described what he was watching in the country around him: assaults on democratic institutions, the erosion of the rule of law. A culture where fear is used to divide people and where some are told, in ways subtle and not so subtle, that they matter more than others. Then came the line that defined the moment. Everywhere we see greed and bigotry being celebrated, bullying and mockery masquerading as strength, ignorance and dishonesty and cruelty and corruption reaping untold rewards. Every single day, the room did not erupt with noise. It reacted with something heavier than noise, recognition. The kind that moves through a crowd not as a wave but as a current, quiet, deep, and impossible to stop once it starts moving. Then came a shout from somewhere in the crowd. One more term. Obama smiled. He paused. The pause lasted just long enough to let the room feel the weight of what was about to follow. Then he said 5 words. I believe in the Constitution. 5 words. That was all. No accusation, no campaign declaration, no direct confrontation with anyone living or present. Just a principle stated clearly in a room full of people who understood exactly what it meant and exactly what it was contrasting against. It was the quietest possible way to draw the loudest possible line, because the contrast did not require explanation. It had already been building for 15 years. Trump warned against war with Iran, then started one. Obama built a deal to contain nuclear risk without conflict. Trump dismantled it. Trump accused Obama of treason without evidence. Obama's office called it a distraction. Obama criticized the political climate. Trump escalated publicly and repeatedly. And then, at a funeral, in a church, in front of thousands of people, and a nationwide broadcast, Obama chose not to argue, not to attack, not to name names or settle scores or perform the kind of righteous fury that crowds sometimes reward in these moments. He chose instead to define a standard, not a person, not a party, a standard. Rooted in law, in restraint, in the idea that power has limits even when ambition does not. That choice matters because of what it says about how the moment was built. Any direct attack would have given the other side something to push back against, a name to invoke, a quote to reframe, a moment to call politically motivated. The machinery of deflection would have activated immediately. Supporters would have defended, critics would have cheered, and the whole thing would have dissolved into the usual performance of outrage moving in opposite directions. But you cannot deflect a standard that was never aimed at anyone specific. You cannot spin a principle into a political attack when no political target was named. You can try, but the attempt only draws more attention to how precisely the description fits, and fitting too precisely is its own kind of exposure. That is the particular power of the unnamed speech. It forces the audience to do the work themselves. And when people arrive at a conclusion on their own, it tends to stick in ways that direct accusation never quite manages. For a country trained to expect noise from its political figures, that quiet contrast may have said more than any direct confrontation ever could. The room heard what was not said as clearly as what was, and what was not said was a name that did not need to be spoken because the description had already done all the work. Some speeches are forgotten by the following morning. They serve their moment and disappear back into the news cycle. Others are never quite forgotten, not because they were louder or angrier or more dramatic than the rest, but because they found a way to say the unsayable thing through the architecture of what they chose to leave out. This was one of those speeches, not because Obama named the problem, but because he described it so precisely that the name became unnecessary. And in a political landscape addicted to volume, choosing precision over noise was perhaps the most powerful move available. The silence said everything, and the 5 words that ended it said the rest. If this moment stayed with you, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because the stories that shape this country are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes the quietest moments carry the longest echo.